Hello and welcome to the first ever regular video on this channel, where I will be taking a look at this generic cornet and also comparing it to the trumpet. And mainly because many of the differences, aside from the different wraps of the tubing, aren't quite so obvious. It's also a test video, and it's also a precursor to another video that I shall produce sometime in the near future about a different cornet that is much more special. Now, as you may have garnered from my playing, I am not a trumpet player, or a high brass player even. My main thing is low brass. So I'm certainly not going to sound as professional on many of these as most people will. But for those of you that are wondering or just happen to find this video and have nothing better to do, then here you go. So off the bat, this instrument in particular is pretty generic and standard. It's Olds Ambassador Cornet. Has a case with it, which I can show you here. There's nothing special about the case. The cornet is actually in pretty good condition despite the aesthetic things that aren't quite as appealing. This is a generic cornet mouthpiece I've cleaned up enough for it to be usable without giving me several diseases. Now, of the several tuning slides on this particular instrument, the only one that works is weirdly the second valve tuning slide. Now, as far as this compares to a trumpet of a similar scale, which this happens to be, as this particular trumpet is a generic King student level trumpet that works quite well, actually. And the mouthpiece on this is a generic Bench 3C mouthpiece. And as you might be able to tell by the fact that I'm calling these mouthpieces generic, I don't exactly have a surplus of them. However, we can actually remove the mouthpieces and immediately get a difference between these two instruments, as the bore difference is so vast that I can almost fit the cornet mouthpiece inside of the trumpet mouthpiece. And if I try to put a trumpet mouthpiece on, I can only just squeeze the tip in. And if I try to do the reverse, it's sort of just, well, it's like throwing a hot dog down a hallway. And if you're wondering, the only functional tuning slide is the third valve tuning slide on this King trumpet. And despite the visual similarities between these two instruments, they are different, and they actually come from totally different lineages. The trumpet comes from the sex horns sort of line of instruments, which before that, it was all of the natural and slide trumpets. And of course, that's a great deal of oversimplification, but it's a trumpet. Now, the cornet actually has different sort of ancestry, as the cornet is derived from the cornopian. And then before the cornopian was a similar-ish line of instruments that, and I could be totally wrong on this, somewhere along the way perhaps goes back to natural French horns. Now, the bores of these two instruments are actually different, as you could probably garner from the mouthpieces. The trumpet bore is very cylindrical. It stays virtually the same throughout the whole instrument, except for the bell section, whereas it's much more conical with the cornet, and thus it gives it to the musically trained ear, a somewhat different tone. Now, of course, the form factors are quite different. However, there's a myriad of different form factors that you can find a cornet in. And they even had long model cornets that looked even more similar to trumpets and just made it further confusing. And so this is just one of many different wraps of cornets that has been produced over the history of the cornet. Now, I'm not an expert player whatsoever, but I'll play a couple of notes so that you can perhaps hear the differences yourself, which will probably only be possible if you're a brass player or musically trained. So you can hear there that the trumpet tone sounds much more punchy in a way, whereas the cornet sort of tone blends much better and is more mellow. And it's because of the bore nature, because of the more conical bore of the cornet, that it lends it that softer, mellower tone to blend better. Whereas the tone of a trumpet is a little bit sharper and more piercing, and it doesn't blend quite as well. And honestly, there's really not much else I can say about this particular instrument because it doesn't have any interesting characteristics. It's very generic in every regard, and it's not even like a professional model or anything. But this video was more of a test than anything, so figured start out on this and then go up from there. So perhaps, if you want to see much more interesting instruments than that, because that's certainly not the most exciting thing, then stay tuned, because I'll definitely have better videos, well, not better, but about better instruments or just more interesting things coming in the near future.